Finally, we're into that part of the book of Daniel that I guess many people are familiar with. We're in to the lion's den. Actually, the details of the lion's den in the chapter that we read are kept to a bare minimum. Just a few verses. That's all you've got, actually, in the text of Daniel 6, covering the incident itself. And that means that the author of Daniel 6 has something much bigger to teach us. And that something has to do with the difference between two types of law that are mentioned in the text and the two powers behind those laws. Did you hear several times in chapter 6 the phrase, the laws of the Medes and Persians? In the law of the state. Jurisprudence calls it positive law. This is statute law, the law enacted and enforced by governments and parliaments. Then there is... Sorry, Jones? All right. Nearly lost you there. Right. Should we start all over again? But did you catch the first few minutes? Yes? Okay, good. So then there is the law of God. Actually, that's only mentioned once in the narrative, when Daniel's enemies realize that the best way to bring this man down is by targeting the faith, which, of course, he expresses every day in prayer. So, you see, you've got Daniel's enemies who want to set the law of the state over and against the law of God. Now, the law of God is, I suppose, what through the centuries people have called natural law, conscience, personal or religious liberty. Now, as soon as you start talking in those terms, you begin to see, don't you, the relevance of this chapter for the 21st century. What is one of the biggest issues today? Human rights. And who defines those human rights? And how we protect their freedom of expression for individuals. So we have the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, which enforces the European Convention. Here's something interesting that I found out. When the Second World War was over, the European Court in Strasbourg came into being after the Nuremberg trials in Germany. The Nazis had used the law of the state, the law of the Medes and the Persians, to impose their evil system in Germany during the 1930s. What's more, it was, remember, Jews like Daniel who were in the firing line of that statute law. And at the Nuremberg trials, the judges declared that Hitler's statutes were contrary to natural law, to natural justice. Now, this idea of natural justice is found in both the United Nations Universal Charter and before that in the United States Declaration of Independence with its well-known phrases. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You see, there's natural law, personal and religious liberty. So far, so good. Because that works until the consensus in a society breaks down. And when that happens, as is the case in Western Europe in the 20th century and into this century, when that breaks down, when the Christian heritage has lost its influence and people no longer agree on the source of this natural justice, then we're in trouble. Because you see, into the vacuum created, the government, the state, public opinion, a dictator, they will step in and decide the terms of the law of the Medes and Persians. So you see, Odessa, we've heard about tonight, Ukraine, and former communist parts of Europe. In many parts of the world, you cannot be a Christian today and express your faith publicly without, for example, breaking Islamic law. And much of the persecution that Christians are facing around the world, and even here in the UK, is the result of laws enacted by the state which require of Christian believers an obedience which they cannot give. You with me? And that's what happens to Daniel. His allegiance to a higher throne than the king of Persia, his conscience is captive to the living God, whose law trumps that of the state. So Daniel in the story has to engage in a gentle act of civil disobedience. He prays to make the point. But in praying, it's enough to get him thrown into the lion's den. Now that's one major lesson of the chapter, I think. The chapter isn't really about how to get out of a lion's cage alive. It's about how to put God first. It's about how to recognize that there are limits to all human government, and any government which assumes the role of God and conscience invites profoundly dangerous consequences. That's the first major lesson. The second is related to it. You see, the Jews of Daniel's day, like the church in our day, like Christians in our day, they were a minority. They were powerless and persecuted, just like many Christians in our society. The spiritual convictions and religious liberties of the Jews were frequently dismissed. And so the question they had is this: how can faith survive in such a hostile climate? Let's bring it down to earth, to us, and our context. How can I be a Christian in my place of work? How can I be a Christian student in university? How can I be a director in a company? How can I be a doctor of medicine and be a believer in Jesus? The answer to that actually lies in the way Daniel handles the pressure points which being a believer in God generate. Firstly, notice with me the impact of a consistent life. The impact of a consistent life. The only reason Daniel ends up in that lion's den is because he lives an utterly predictable life of faith. You see, Daniel's public and private faces are one and the same. His convictions produce integrity, both in his professional life and in his private, domestic life. He is the same man in both settings. Let me show you what I mean. As the chapter opens, Daniel is 80 years of age. Clearly, he's not heard of retirement plans and drawing a pension. He's 80 and he's still serving the emperor. For 60 years, he has been a brilliant public servant. If you've ever watched Yes, Prime Minister, Daniel is the Sir Humphrey of his day. To 3 emperors, he has provided for all those years amazing loyalty during a distinguished career in the civil service. First, the Babylonian, and then the Persian. He graduated with honors out of the university as a 20-year-old. King Nebuchadnezzar promoted him, and now Darius the Mede, whose Persian army ransacked Babylon in 539 BC, just as 50 years earlier, Nebuchadnezzar's troops ran riot through Jerusalem, deporting the young Daniel. Darius the Mede recognizes the talents of this now 80-year-old civil servant. And Darius makes Daniel one of 3 regional administrators. And he's about to appoint him, according to verse 3, to be the chief of his entire kingdom. When, at that point, professional jealousy amongst his civil service colleagues and perhaps racism mean that they will stop at nothing to bring him down. Daniel the Jew. Daniel is that familiar type in history, an expatriate Jew who makes a major contribution to his society. Think of all the Jewish Nobel Prize winners in art and music and literature and science and medicine. They've had immense impact. Of course, to the Jewish generation of his own day, Daniel was a great example. He showed how it was possible to have faith in God and be thoroughly involved in society, even a society which did not share your spiritual values. And Daniel, I think, has the same inspirational impact on those of us with faith today. Because his career tells us you can rise to a position of great influence and not compromise your religious convictions. In fact, those convictions can change the environment in which you work. We call it, don't we, being salt and light. You don't have to apologize for being talented and a Christian. You can become a significant leader in your company, a well-paid executive, a highly respected figure in the university, and still hold on to your faith with integrity. You can be 80 and going for it with God. The past and the present are full of such examples to encourage us. In the fields of sport and music and politics and commerce, there are Christian men and women who follow Christ and enjoy the admiration of their colleagues. They are experts in their disciplines. They are the best in class. They are the highest achievers. There's nothing wrong with that. Can I say this? You don't need to be a missionary or a full-time pastor to be truly spiritual. Christian lawyers, Christian doctors, Christian housewives, Christian students, Christian carers can all have significant vocations and make an impact in their society if, and it's a big if, like Daniel, their life is consistent. You see, Daniel is that very rare species in public political life. He is not corrupt. That's what verse 2 says. With 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel, the satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. That was presumably why the king chose Daniel for such high office. He could be trusted. The king's treasury would not suffer loss with Daniel in charge. He was honest. There'd be no backhanders on Daniel's watch. There'd be no money rackets. There'd be no corruption. The king's exchequer would get what it was owed. And ironically, it was that very fact of his probity, his honesty, which made Daniel a target for his enemies, who saw that with him in charge, their game was up. Not only was he a Jew, he was an honest Jew. Now, what was the secret of Daniel's public consistency? Well, you don't need to look far to find it, do you? Although it seems to take his fellow civil servants a very long time. Verse 4, at this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. But then they twigged. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis of charge against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God." There it is. His vulnerable spot was his faith, his religious convictions, his conscience. So these men knew that if they could get Darius to enact a law, even a temporary one, which forbade praying to anyone for 30 days except to the king, then Daniel would get caught out. They knew that, for he was as consistent in his devotion to God as he was in his stewardship of the public purse. And so there they were, watching him every day, and they understood his routines. And that made Daniel, just as it had made his three friends before, vulnerable. You see, here in Babylon was a society which was opposed to the very idea that there could be over everyone a moral lawgiver whose rule was greater than all others. A God who could command the loyalty of the heart and mind. In such an environment, Daniel was a sitting duck. Let me bring it home to us. When we are faithful to the God of the Bible, sometimes the world will take advantage of us. It may even persecute us. The question asked by the narrative is this: have we the courage to cope with that, to stand, sometimes alone, for our faith consistently? For it's Daniel's commitment to that primary obedience which is about to be tested. And so we move to the trap of a foolish law. Listen to verse 6. So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, "O King Darius, live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den." Of course, you can see, can't you, why such an edict appealed to the king. Not only was this an ego boost for Darius, he was being given a king appreciation month. He became for 30 days the only mediator between the gods and men. But also, this edict could be seen as a very wise political move. In an empire as vast as the Persian Empire, with so many nationalities and cultures and religions and worldviews, what better for unity than one law for everyone? What a great way to enforce social cohesion, making every citizen sign up to the new regime. Okay, it involved a temporary infringement of personal liberty, but that was a small price to pay for the benefits. So the trap was set. And Daniel, of course, walked straight into it. Verse 10. Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, listen to this, just as he had done before. That's it. Just as he had done before. There's consistency for you. His devotional life, like his professional public life, had the same character of integrity. For as Daniel prayed, in his normal, disciplined way, he was making a massive statement. He was saying to Darius, like all kings and governments, you have to learn that there is a higher law than the law of the Medes and Persians, the law of God, and that a man's conscience has to obey that. Now, again, all of that must have been wonderfully helpful to the Jews in exile. You see, the question they were asking was, how could they hold on to their identity as God's people when all the familiar markers of their faith, the temple in Jerusalem, the priesthood, the sacrifices, when all that had been taken away, and they were surrounded in Babylon by the idols of their culture. And here was one of their own, Daniel, a high-ranking public servant who never lost a sense of who he was. For 60 years, he maintained his faith in the public square. Here he was, a man known as someone of integrity and prayer. He could still practice his faith. A man of prayer. Do you see what we're being told about prayer? Prayer is the one thing that can never be taken away from us. Do you realize that? They may shut down our churches. They may burn our Bibles. They may imprison our leaders. They may destroy our houses, but they can never, ever stop us praying. For no matter how isolated we may be, how on our own in the student campus, in the school, prayer gives every believer immediate access to God. Nonetheless, it was a pretty brave decision for Daniel to keep on praying, as was his custom, because he knew the likely consequences, the lion's den. Do you know, thinking about this, perhaps it was that very habit which held Daniel together in this huge crisis. He did what he had always done. He made no changes. He had made prayer part of his daily routine, and that very routine was now his inner strength. I think it's easy in our culture, in our contemporary culture, sometimes to dismiss habit. You know, the repetition of things again and again. It's very easy to dismiss the habit of prayer as a boring, joyless drudge. But let me tell you, in the Christian life, discipline feeds faithfulness. You got that? Discipline feeds faithfulness. Doing the same thing over and over and over again, it bolsters courage. It gives you your identity. In this crisis, it was Daniel's habit of prayer which set him free from the fear of the law of the Medes and Persians, and instead free to live for God. You know, in some respects, the biggest miracle of this chapter is not Daniel's deliverance from the lion's den, but his commitment to keep on praying, in spite of what the outcome was going to be. He still prayed. I reckon that Daniel had already won the battle for his heart before he was thrown into the lion's den. It took supreme courage to get on his knees and pray in his room. Now, why does he make that the line in the sand? Why would he not back down on prayer? The king's decree for Daniel was a matter of breaking the first commandment. You will have no other gods before me, says the Lord. Even when, as here, it's only for a month. So prayer is the way that Daniel keeps the first commandment and reinforces who he is and for whom he lives. You see, as Daniel knelt down to pray, he was telling the world what mattered most to him: the worship of his God, not the idol of his own safety and security. In the story, the spies return from eavesdropping below Daniel's open window to tell the king in verse 13, Daniel, who's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. You see, It's at that point that Darius realizes that he's been trapped too by his own inflexible law. All day, we read, he frantically tries to find some legal loophole. That's how much he valued his right-hand man. But he's caught. And so the king gives the order, and they bring Daniel and throw him into the lion's den. And this is amazing. And the king says to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." Well, that's amazing. Darius is praying to the very God whom he has just sentenced Daniel to death for praying to. So much, you see, for the unchangeable laws of the Medes and Persians. There's irony in the narrative. The author is smiling at this point because he wants us to understand how limited even tyrants really are and how foolish the laws they make. Better to be in a den of lions with faith than to be a great king in a palace with no faith at all. And so finally, the rescue of a faithful God. Darius thought that this was going to be the end of his chief secretary to the treasury. So he goes to the lion's den and calls out to his friend Daniel, not expecting a response, of course, but he gets one. "O king," Daniel answers, "live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me." But now what's to be done? "I know," thinks the king. "I will issue another decree to get me out of the first one and overturn it." You can see how useless the laws of the Medes and Persians are beginning to look. And what is extraordinary is that the new statute the king proclaims doesn't forbid prayer to Daniel's God. It actually commands it. So verse 26, "I issue a decree," says Darius, "that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." Isn't that terrific? Because in those words, the Persian king gets as close to anyone in summing up the entire message of the book of Daniel. What's that message? What's Darius's proclamation? God is sovereign. That's what the king of Persia is recognizing, that God is sovereign, that there is no law higher than his, that every conscience, that every government is accountable finally to him. His kingdom, says the king, God's kingdom is forever. It is universal. It is eternal. The kingdoms of this world come and go, but the kingdom of God remains. You see, in Daniel's rescue, God is saying to us, my law is the law. My kingdom is the kingdom. God is sovereign. Secondly, God is faithful. The God of Daniel has power to save. This God can shut the mouths of lions. What a morale booster the end of this adventure would have been to those exiled Jews hearing of the tale of Daniel. And so remarkable was this event that it's recorded hundreds of years later in the New Testament letter to the Hebrews, in chapter 11 and verse 33. Who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions. Of course, just one or two verses on in Hebrews chapter 11, the Bible contains the stories of those who weren't rescued. Others were tortured and refused to be released. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They were destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. Maybe that's a helpful corrective in case we think that the lions will never devour us. The Bible never promises that when the people of God stand up for him faithfully, risking their lives, the outcome will always be a happy one. Daniel was prepared to pay the cost of obedience to God, whatever. That's why he didn't stop praying when he was told to. I reckon that's the challenge that we face. Are we prepared to die for what we believe in? Is obedience to God and his law worth giving our lives for? Because that's what makes Christians different. Here's another illustration from the Second World War. A Lutheran pastor, seeing that many of the churches in Germany had failed to show moral courage and stand up against Hitler, wrote what became known as the Declaration of Guilt. Martin Niemöller was the pastor concerned. He said this: "When Hitler attacked the Jews, I was not a Jew, therefore I was not concerned. And when Hitler attacked the Catholics, I was not a Catholic, and therefore I was not concerned. And when Hitler attacked the unions and industrialists, I was not a member of the unions, and I was not concerned. Then Hitler attacked me and the Protestant church, and there was nobody left to be concerned." We're about to share communion together to remember the death of Christ for us. At the center of our faith is the worship of one who, just like Daniel, was the victim of a plot. He found himself before Roman justice. At his trial, he said to Pontius Pilate, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." And they put a stone over Jesus' tomb and sealed the entrance, just as in Daniel chapter 6, they sealed the lion's den. But death, just like the lions, didn't swallow Jesus. He broke the chains of death to affirm the glorious kingdom and sovereign power of God. There in Jerusalem, an empty hole in the ground, the proof of God's living power and his coming rule. It was precisely that kingdom which Daniel had been living and praying for in his rooms in Babylon. That's why he opened his windows and prayed to Jerusalem and remembered its fallen temple and ruined city gates. He was asking God to restore his people and to bring them back home. That's why Daniel served the emperors of Babylon and Persia, because he understood that the city of God would triumph one day over the city of man. That's why he disobeyed the king and carried on praying. That's why he faced death, prepared to fall into the arms of the living God, because Daniel was witnessing to the world about the true God and the kingdom that he would bring into being at the end of time. It's rather bizarre, given the anti-Christian and anti-faith agenda which seems so prevalent in our Western civilization nowadays. But it's that biblical vision of the future which is inscribed on the walls of the UN building in New York. Words taken from Isaiah's prophecy about beating their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And nations will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. You see, that's the future which men like Daniel lived for. It's the future which Christ died and rose again to make a reality. It's the future which Christians are called to work and pray for, whatever the cost. And sometimes, folks, that personal cost is very significant. We may be called by God to go through deep waters, to experience terrible loneliness because we are followers of Jesus, to endure the loss of all we love for his sake. Of course, that's nothing like the price that Jesus paid, and we remember now. But as we go through those fiery trials, know this: the risen Christ is with us. For the soul that in Jesus has found its repose, he will not, he cannot desert to its foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, he'll never, no, never, no, never forsake. Let's stand and sing that hymn. How firm a foundation, you saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you he has said to all who for refuge to Jesus have fled? Let's stand to sing, and then the helpers will gather in the front pew here to serve communion to us.